Imagine walking into a bookstore, right? You head over to the religion section, you grab two different Bibles off the shelf, and you open them to the exact same passage.
You'd expect them to say the exact same thing.
Right, you would completely expect that. But they don't. In fact, depending on which two books you actually picked up, you might find that entire stories are just missing from one of them.
Oh, absolutely. Or, the underlying theology subtly shifts depending on the translation.
Yeah, exactly. Or even the table of contents itself is just entirely different. Like, one of those books might be based on the absolute oldest ink ever discovered by archaeologists,
Right.
but then the other one might be based on the specific text that, like, billions of people actively read and memorized for 1,000 years.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. So you're left standing in the aisle with this massive question, like, which one is the real text?
And that scenario, it's the perfect illustration of why that section in a bookstore is so paralyzing for people.
Oh, for sure.
Because you aren't just making a simple purchase, You're stepping into this really complex web of historical decisions, textual debates, and ancient traditions.
Right, because the term Bible kind of implies this single monolithic object, handed down through time in this uniform binding.
Exactly, but the reality is much more fragmented than that.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to basically give you a map for that overwhelming bookstore experience.
Which you definitely need.
You really do. We have a stack of sources detailing the sheer volume of English translations, the radically different formats, the shifting lists of included books, and the ancient Greek manuscripts that serve as a foundation for it all.
Right, we're really getting into the weeds today.
We are. We're unpacking how this massive global text functions, and more importantly, how to figure out which versions you can actually trust if your goal is to study traditional historic Christianity.
And to navigate this, we really have to recognize that the text sitting on the shelf is categorized by three distinct foundational pillars.
Okay, what are those?
We're looking at translation philosophy, canon, and textual basis. And if you walk into this blindly without understanding those three variables, the sheer volume of choices will just leave you completely lost.
Okay, let's unpack the sheer volume first. Because our sources point out there are over 450 English versions of this text alone.
Yeah, it's a staggering number.
And then when you factor in study editions, layout changes, modern updates, that number skyrockets to over 900 options.
Oh.
Yeah. Trying to buy one is not like picking up a standard novel. I mean, it is much more like navigating an open source software project.
That is a great way to put it.
Right. You have different developers or, denominations using completely different underlying code bases to build a final product that serves their specific user base.
The software analogy works perfectly here, because to figure out which version you can trust, we have to start by separating the physical packaging, right? The user interface.
Yep.
We have to separate that from the actual translation, which is like the operating system.
Yeah.
Because bookstores generally sort their shelves by format.
Right, like you'll see study Bibles packed with historical footnotes.
Or large print editions.
Yeah.
Or those wide margin journaling Bibles for note-taking.
Oh, or parallel Bibles that print two different translations side by side.
Exactly. But those formats are just the apps on your phone.
Right. Like you might have 5 different weather apps on your phone. One has radar, one just shows the temperature, one has this like cool minimalist design.
But they're all pulling from the exact same meteorological data.
Exactly. The format dictates how you interact with the text, but it doesn't change the underlying language. The translation, however, that is the actual operating system. That is where the actual English words shift.
Right. And those operating systems sit on a very specific spectrum.
Okay, tell us about the spectrum.
Well, on one end, you have word-for-word translations, which scholars sometimes call formal equivalence.
Formal equivalence, okay.
Yeah. The philosophy here is to prioritize the grammatical structure of the original Hebrew and Greek.
So this is where the King James Version sits, right?
Exactly. The King James and the New King James sit here carrying, 400 years of traditional language.
Right.
And alongside them, you have modern word-for-word translations like the ESV and the NASB, which are highly utilized in traditional circles today for their really rigid accuracy.
Okay, so that's one end. But moving down that spectrum, the software changes slightly to thought-for-thought translations.
Right, exactly.
So versions like the NIV or the CSB, they try to balance that rigid technical accuracy with modern readability, right?
Yeah, they want the sentences to flow smoothly in contemporary English, so they focus on translating the meaning of the phrase rather than the exact syntax of every single word.
And then you reach the far end of the spectrum, which is the paraphrase.
Yes.
The paraphrase.
And the most prominent example of this is the Message, right?
That's probably the most famous one, yeah. A paraphrase isn't a direct translation from the ancient languages at all.
Really? Then what is it? It's basically an author's attempt to capture the broad emotional tone or the narrative sweep of a passage. It almost reads like a modern novel.
Okay, wait. If the goal of our deep dive is finding historical accuracy and traditional trustworthiness, I have to challenge the idea of a paraphrase entirely.
Oh, go for it.
Because if paraphrases like the Message are explicitly known to be historically imprecise, isn't it actually dangerous for churches to encourage reading them? I mean, why use a tool that deliberately alters the historical phrasing?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the danger only arises when you confuse the tool's purpose.
What do you mean?
Paraphrases are viewed by scholars strictly as tools for devotional reading. Like, if a reader is struggling to understand the overarching narrative of a notoriously dense historical book, a paraphrase can kind of unlock the story.
Okay, I get that.
But you hit the crucial point for traditional doctrine. Historic Christianity requires that you avoid paraphrases as a primary study textbook.
Because doctrine requires precision. You can't build a massive theological framework on a sentence that was entirely reshaped to sound catchy to a 21st century reader.
Precisely. Traditional Christianity relies heavily on those word-for-word translations.
Right, the KJV, NKJV, NASB, ESV, and the RSV.
Right. The translators of these versions actively refuse to smooth out the sentences just to appease a modern ear.
So if the original Greek was clunky, they leave it clunky.
Exactly. If the original grammatical structure was complex or slightly awkward, a word-for-word translation will often intentionally leave it slightly awkward in English.
Wow.
Preserving the exact syntax is paramount, because those minor grammatical details, like whether a word is singular or plural, past tense or present, they form the absolute bedrock of traditional doctrine.
But even if you perfectly translate the text from Greek to English, you hit a much bigger problem.
Oh, definitely.
Because it's one thing to debate how to translate the words, but you have to decide which words are even allowed in the building. And history shows us nobody actually agrees on that.
No, they really don't.
This is our second pillar, the canonical divide. Because the table of contents isn't the same everywhere.
And this often catches people off guard. The actual list of included books, the canon changes entirely depending on the historic tradition you're looking at.
Right.
We can map out 4 major canon families that kind of define the landscape today.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the numbers. If you open a standard Protestant Bible, you're looking at 66 books.
Yep.
But if you pick up a Catholic Bible, that table of contents expands to 73 books.
Right, because the Catholic tradition includes the deuterocanonical books.
The deuterocanonical books.
Yeah, these are historical and wisdom texts like Tobit, the Book of Wisdom, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees.
And it expands even from there, because the Eastern Orthodox tradition includes anywhere from 76 to 81 books, depending on the regional church.
That's right.
And then you have the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, which has 81 plus books. It brings in ancient texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees.
Books that the other 3 major families do not include at all.
Not at all. So how did we get a table of contents that varies by up to 15 books depending on where you worship?
Well, the variation comes down to the historical anchors each tradition claimed. For the Old Testament, the early historic church heavily utilized an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint.
Okay, the Septuagint.
Right, and the Septuagint included those extra books, the Apocrypha. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions anchored themselves to that Greek tradition and the subsequent Latin Vulgate, so they kept those books in their canon for centuries.
But then the Reformation completely fractured that consensus, didn't it?
It completely shattered it, yeah.
Because the Protestant reformers in the 1500s decided they needed to bypass the Greek and Latin translations and go straight back to the original Hebrew texts kept by the Jewish community.
Exactly. And since the Hebrew Masoretic text didn't include books like Tobit or Maccabees, the Protestant reformers eventually just dropped them from their canon entirely. The mechanism of how the canon formed dictates what you are holding, which means defining a traditional Bible requires defining your historical era.
Right. So when someone claims a certain Bible is missing books, they're just telling you which historical era they're using as their anchor.
Basically, yes.
Like a Protestant sees the Catholic Bible as having extra books, while an Ethiopian Christian looks at the Protestant Bible and wonders where a massive chunk of their scripture went.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, if you, the listener, want a pre-Reformation traditional canon, meaning that texts utilized broadly across Europe before the 1500s, you must seek out a Bible that includes the Apocrypha.
So what would they look for on the shelf?
You'd look for something branded as the RSVCE, the Catholic edition, the ESVCE, or the Orthodox Study Bible.
Okay, so you really have to align the canon you purchase with the specific historical tradition you want to study.
Exactly. We aren't making a theological declaration on which table of contents is the ultimate authority here, but you need the map to know what ecosystem you're entering.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we've picked our translation software and we've established our canonical modules. Now we have to look under the hood at the source code itself.
Yes, textual basis.
Right, our third pillar. What are these English words actually being translated from? And this is where the archaeological history gets really fascinating.
It's incredible. All of these English New Testaments are built upon ancient Greek manuscripts, but, and here's the catch, they don't all use the same ones.
Right.
The sources break down two major Greek text families that serve as the master blueprints for the translations we read today. The first is called the Textus Receptus, which roughly translates to the received text.
And this is the blueprint of historic usage, right? Like it was the Greek text compiled in the 1500s by scholars like Erasmus based on the manuscripts they had available at the time.
Right.
And it became the undisputed foundation for the historic church for centuries. It served as the master blueprint for the King James Version and later the New King James Version.
Exactly. But then the second family is known as the critical text. And this blueprint is based on archaeological antiquity.
How so?
Well, over the last 2 centuries, specifically since the 1800s, scholars and archaeologists began discovering much older surviving fragments of papyrus and parchment in monasteries and deserts.
Like buried in jars and caves and stuff.
Exactly. And because these discoveries were significantly older than the manuscripts used for the Textus Receptus, scholars compiled them into this new critical text. Today, this serves as the foundation for modern translations like the ESV, the NASB, the NIV, and NRSV.
Think about how those two different blueprints actually alter the final building, you know?
Right.
You have the Textus Receptus, which is the blueprint every builder used for hundreds of years to maintain the house. Then you have the critical text, which is this older, earlier draft of the plans dug out of the basement centuries later.
I love that analogy.
And when you compare those two blueprints side by side, there are actual architectural differences.
There really are. This raises an important question because the variations between the two are technically a very small percentage of the overall text, but they are highly significant.
Right, because the critical text relies on older manuscripts, but those older manuscripts sometimes just omit entire verses or phrases that were present in the Textus Receptus.
They do.
Let's give a concrete example of what happens when these blueprints clash, because this blew my mind. Look at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16.
Oh, this is a huge one.
Yeah. In the Textus Receptus blueprint, the ending includes verses 9 through 20. It features this dramatic conclusion where Jesus appears to the disciples, and there is explicit discussion of believers handling snakes and drinking deadly poison without being harmed.
Right, and this text was read by the church for centuries.
For centuries!
But if your Bible is built on the critical text blueprint, that ending looks entirely different. When scholars examined the absolute oldest surviving papyri discovered in the 1800s, they realized those specific snake-handling verses were simply not there.
Just gone.
Gone. The Gospel of Mark in those ancient fragments seems to end abruptly at verse 8, with the women fleeing the empty tomb in terror. So modern English translations built on the critical text will either put a massive bracket around verses 9 through 20, or they'll insert a bold footnote right in the text, warning the reader, like, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include this ending.
The theological implications there are just massive depending on your tradition.
It's huge.
And it happens again in the letters of John. Take 1 John 5.7. In the Textus Receptus, there is this very explicit, clearly spelled out reference to the Trinity, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost being one.
Right. It's a foundational proof text for a core doctrine.
Exactly. But in the older manuscripts of the critical text, that explicit phrase is just absent.
It really is. The doctrine of the Trinity is still taught elsewhere in the text, obviously, but that specific powerful sentence vanishes.
And even deeply familiar verses shift depending on the source code, like John 3.16.
Yeah, the traditional Textus Receptus translates a key phrase describing Jesus as the only begotten Son, which implies a very specific theological mechanism of generation.
Right, only begotten.
But modern critical text translations, looking at the older vocabulary usage,
Sure.
often translate it simply as the one and only Son.
It's a subtle shift, but for groups that prioritize historical doctrine, nuance is everything. The blueprint dictates the theology.
It really does.
So with all these moving parts, the translation philosophy, the expanding and contracting canon, and these dueling Greek blueprints, how did the major historic branches of Christianity actually decide what to read?
Well, let's trace how these traditions historically anchored themselves to the text. The historic branches navigated this by establishing standard texts that defined their specific communities.
Right.
For example, the Orthodox Church historically anchored itself to the Septuagint for the Old Testament, prioritizing the Greek translation over the Hebrew.
And today?
Today, in English, Orthodox believers heavily utilize the NKJV or the ESV for their New Testament readings.
Okay, that makes sense. And it makes sense that the Catholic Church, operating in the Latin-speaking West, held on to the Latin Vulgate for roughly a millennium. I mean, it was the absolute standard of medieval Christianity.
Exactly. And today, Catholic scholars translating into English rely heavily on the RSVCE, the NRSVCE, and for those wanting strict traditionalism, the historic Douay Rheims translation.
Now, the traditional Protestant branch is where the massive shift occurred, right?
Yes. By rejecting the Vulgate and returning to the Hebrew and Greek, they needed a new standard, and the King James Version became that undisputed anchor.
Yeah, for 330 years, it was essentially the only Bible the English-speaking Protestant world used. It shaped the entire culture.
It really did.
And today, while the KJV is still revered, traditional Protestantism has expanded to utilize the NKJV, the ESV, and NASB as their modern anchors.
Right.
So what does this all mean? Synthesizing everything we've mapped out from the sources today, if you are walking into that bookstore,
Yep, back to the bookstore.
back to the bookstore. And your goal is a strictly pre-1900 traditional reading experience, meaning you want the historical texture, the robust theological language, and the textual basis that defined historic English Christianity for centuries.
Your safest bets are going to be the KJV, the NKJV, the ESV, the NASB, the RSV, or the Douay Rheims.
All right.
Those versions provide the historical tether. And the reason these specific versions remain the hallmark of traditional Christianity is how they treat the reader.
Say more about that.
Historic churches consistently view the text as an educational anchor rather than just a motivational tool. They lean away from thought-for-thought paraphrases because they believe the ancient text is supposed to shape and challenge the reader. They do not want to reshape the text to fit the comfort of the modern reader.
Right, you don't want a 21st century idiom accidentally obscuring a first century theological concept.
Exactly.
You want the text to demand something of you, even if the grammar feels a bit foreign or clunky.
Exactly the point of formal equivalence translation. When you understand the philosophy driving these choices, that wall of options at the bookstore stops looking like a chaotic mess.
Yeah, it organizes itself into a highly specific set of tools, each forged for a different historical purpose.
That's right.
Well, we have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the sheer overwhelming volume of English versions, identifying that a large print or study Bible is just the packaging, while the true mechanism is the translation software running under the hood.
Right.
And we explored the canonical divide, tracking how the Reformation caused a split between the 66-book Protestant text and the larger Catholic, Orthodox, and Ethiopian canons.
And then we dug into the ancient Greek source code.
Yes. Seeing how the Textus Receptus and the critical text literally change the endings of stories and the phrasing of core doctrines.
So now you are equipped with the map. You understand the translation philosophy, the canon, and the textual basis. You can look at any text on that shelf and know exactly what historical engine is running inside it.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a thought experiment.
Ooh, okay.
It's a tension rooted right in the source material we discuss, specifically regarding those ancient Greek manuscripts. It is the paradox of the Textus Receptus versus the critical text.
It is arguably the most fascinating tension in biblical history.
Right, because the critical text relies on manuscripts dug out of the sand in the 1800s. Because they're older, they are technically closer in time to the original writings of the apostles.
Right, they represent the oldest surviving ink.
But on the other side, the Textus Receptus and the Latin Vulgate represent the actual texts that were actively used, copied, and read by the historic church for 1,000 years.
Yes.
I mean, even if they were based on slightly later manuscripts, those were the specific words that shaped the doctrine, the culture, and the prayers of billions of people.
Which leaves anyone seeking historic truth with a really profound question.
Right, when you are searching for traditional Christianity, which carries more weight.
Exactly. Is the true text the oldest surviving ink that sat buried and unread in a jar for a millennium?
Or is the true text the one that centuries of believers actually held in their hands and used to build the church?
It's an amazing question.
It is the oldest ink versus the oldest active tradition. The blueprint found buried in the basement versus the blueprint that actually built the house. Let that thought linger the next time you open up to a familiar verse and notice that the words have subtly changed.